This happened about 2 years ago in the summer. I was 18 at the time, and I still lived with my parents. I was done high school though, and I already had my driver's license. I had recently bought my first car, which was a used Toyota in pretty good shape. I still have the car actually. It was around midnight, and I was alone on the road. I had been visiting friends in a neighboring town, and I was on my way back to my house. It was about a 45-minute drive in total, and I was 15 minutes in, so not even that far from home. The road was fairly remote. It would be a stretch to call it a highway, because it was just a single lane each way, but the speed limit was high. I think it was 60 miles per hour. It could be a dangerous road for that reason, and also because there was sparse cell reception around there. There were some streetlights along the way, but they were few and far between, just enough to break the monotony of the empty road. I was bored and tired, so I had a hard time keeping my eyes open. I was looking forward to going to bed. Then in the distance, I saw a man standing beside a car with the hazard lights blinking. He looked stuck, like he needed help, so I slowed down, pulling up beside him. The man was about 50 years old and looked fairly normal. He had a plaid-collared shirt and glasses, not a threatening-looking guy at all. I stayed in my car, but rolled down my window about a third of the way. "Hey there," I called out. "Need a hand?" The man turned, his face weary but grateful. "Oh, thank you. I've been stuck here for ages. Could you give me a lift to the nearest town?" I hesitated. It's not something that you usually do, picking up strangers, especially alone in the middle of the night. I replied, "I can't give you a ride, but I'll call for help." He frowned, his eyes narrowing. "Come on, man. It's just a short ride. I'd really appreciate it." I shook my head, but firmly said, "Sorry, I can't. Let me call someone for you, though." I could tell he was frustrated, but he was trying to hide it behind a forced smile. He took a few steps closer to my car. He was now standing right next to my window. I tried to discreetly lock the doors, but when I did, it made a noticeable click sound. The man obviously noticed. I looked up at him again, and he still had that forced-looking smile. He then looked down at me and said, "Sure, please call AAA. My phone is dead." I pulled out my phone, almost hoping it didn't have service. When my screen came to life, I saw that it did, so I started dialing for AAA. Suddenly, he lunged towards my car, trying to force his way in. His arm shot through my open window, and I could see his hand trying to unlock the door. Luckily, he couldn't find it right away, and I was fast enough to make a move. I slammed the gas pedal and sped away. His arm was still in my car when I started moving. I looked back after a few seconds and saw the man getting up from the ground. I guess I managed to knock him off his feet as I drove away. He deserved worse. I kept driving until I got to my town. There's a gas station as soon as you get there, and I pulled into the parking lot. I dialed the police and blurted out my story. I waited in that parking lot for the cops. Eventually, an officer approached me where I was waiting. We talked for a few minutes, and then he told me that when he went to the spot, there was no one there. There was not a single car stopped along that stretch of highway. To me, that confirmed what should have already been obvious. The car was not broken down at all. I still don't know exactly what his intentions were. I assume that if I let that guy into my car, I would have been robbed, or worse. As I drove away, I couldn't help but glance in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man in his supposedly broken down car, but there was nothing, just an empty road and fading light. I got home at around 2 a.m. and went straight to bed, but hardly slept. In the morning, I told my parents everything. The man has still not been caught, and I've been paying attention to the news to see if anything similar has been reported, but nothing's come up. I never saw that guy again. My name's Gary, and this happened to me during my last year of high school. I live in West Tennessee, and we usually get 2 or 3 snow days each year. The area isn't used to much snow, so normally a small amount could get us out for the day. This particular day should have been a snow day, but for whatever reason, the school decided that the roads were safe enough to drive on, even though some patches of the road had ice on it. We were all annoyed, but we went to school anyway. After school was let out, I went to my friend John's house, and we hung out playing video games until it was pretty dark. I then decided to drive home. Mind you, the roads had gotten better, but there was still some ice there. It was about 15 minutes into the drive from John's house to mine, but I was trying to be extra careful not to hit any ice. Because of that, it was going to be a bit longer than usual. Pulling out of John's neighborhood, there's a blind hill that always stresses me out, because if somebody came through fast, then they might rear-end me. The road wasn't very busy, so it's never been a big deal. This time, however, a car came over that hill right as I pulled out. They had to slam on the brakes because I just pulled in front of them. In my defense, they were going too fast, but I still felt bad about it. They laid on the horn and were clearly angry at me. I gave a small apology wave and then went on my way with them still behind me. 10 minutes later, they were still behind me, tailgating me with their brights on. They made it hard for me to see. I was getting nervous because they were clearly mad, and I realized by that point that they were following me. I didn't know what to do, and definitely didn't want to lead them to my house, so I began taking random turns and trying to lose them. However, they were right on me the whole time. Eventually, I started driving faster so that maybe I could get enough distance between us and then make a turn that they wouldn't see. Big mistake. In hindsight, I should have driven to the police station, but for whatever reason, I thought that was a bad idea. Going a good deal over the speed limit, I found a turn and began to slightly brake so I wouldn't have to turn at full speed. But when I was beginning the turn, I hit a patch of black ice and my car slid off the road into a small ditch. I didn't want to floor it because I was afraid my car would tip over onto its side. I just sat there in disbelief until I looked in my rearview mirror. I saw that the other car was now parked on the side of the road and the driver and passenger doors were open. Before I knew it, my car door swung open. A man unbuckled my seatbelt and pulled me out of the car. I really regret not locking my door because the man and his friend proceeded to kick the ever-living crap out of me while I curled up into a ball and screamed for them to stop. They just kept cussing at me and kicking me until they were satisfied enough, and they got back into their car and left. At that point, I was completely shaken. I got back into my car and called my mom. She told me to call the police, and that she said she would be on her way to pick me up. The police arrived, but I didn't have much to tell them other than that the two guys drove in a sedan and they followed me from that neighborhood, then beat me up. It was dark, so I didn't know what kind of car they had or what they looked like. Because of that, the cops never found out who beat me up that night. If I had just driven to the police station instead of trying to lose them, then I would have saved myself a lot of pain. I had been working as a taxi driver in a big city for around 5 years at the time. I don't do it anymore, but this happened in around 2010, before Uber really took off. It was late fall, and where I live, the weather can get really gloomy at that time of year. It can get really cold at night, and that combined with the rain can lead to a really uncomfortable situation outside. There have been more than a few times that I've picked someone up, and I'm pretty sure that I saved them from getting hypothermia. It can be dangerous out there if you're not careful. The rain was pouring down in sheets that night. It was the kind of rain that fell in big fat drops. I sat there at the wheel of my taxi. The rhythmic swish of the wipers was almost hypnotic. I had been on the road for a few hours at that point, but I was already feeling tired. It was a busy night on the weekend though, and I was making pretty good money, so I pulled into a gas station and grabbed a coffee after filling up my car. With that energy, I took a few more passengers. I took two guys home from a bar downtown. They lived in one of the rougher parts of the city. I knew the area really well, and that was a place that I tried to avoid when I could. I was eager to get out of there, so I started driving as soon as the guys left my car. I made it to a better part of town and was ready to keep working. That's when I saw a man at the side of the road hailing me from the curb. He was a tall man. His face was hidden beneath the brim of a soaked hat. The rain was still coming down, and this guy was not dressed for it. I was happy to help him out, so I pulled my car over to the side of the street. He jumped in, water dripping from his face. "Hey there," I said. "Where can I take you tonight?"
"East side,"
he mumbled, barely audible over the drumming rain. I nodded and pulled away from the curb, my tires hissing on the wet pavement. I was expecting a specific address, but I thought I would give the guy a chance to dry off and warm up before pressing him for it. My new passenger slouched in the back, his movements sluggish. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of a scar running down his jaw. I didn't know what to think about that. It made him look rough, like the kind of guy you would avoid on the street. As we drove down the road, conversation was sparse. The man seemed lost in thought. His eyes were fixed on the streaks of water running down the window. I focused on the road, my grip firm on the wheel. Finally, we reached the east side, and I hadn't gotten the address out of him. The buildings here were older, worn by the years and lack of maintenance. I pulled to a stop by an alley. "Anywhere in particular, or is this close enough?" I said, twisting to look back at him. He turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting mine. Then without a word, he reached into his coat and pulled out a gun. He pointed it at me through the plastic divider.
"Give me everything,"
he growled. I fumbled for my wallet, fingers shaking. When I handed it over, I watched him rifle through it. He glanced back at me, a twisted smile on his face.
"Keys,"
he demanded. I hesitated for a moment, and then I tossed them to him. He caught them easily, the metal jingling in his palm.
"Get out,"
he ordered, waving his gun towards the door. I stumbled out of the car, the rain soaking through my clothes. He slammed the door shut and peeled away, leaving me standing in the alley, breathless and shaken. I watched the red taillights vanish into the night, and then sank to my knees. The cold pavement was biting through my pants. My mind raced, and I had no idea what to do. I'd never felt so vulnerable, so violated. After what felt like an hour, I managed to pull myself to my feet. I stumbled out of the alley and onto the street. My shoes were splashing through the puddles. I needed help. I needed to find a phone, and I needed to get out of the rain. I knew it was cold, but I was so shaken that it hardly bothered me. I spotted a diner across the street and stumbled towards it. My legs were heavy and uncoordinated. The bell above the door jingled as I pushed it open. The diner was nearly empty, just a few patrons hunched over their plates. I approached the counter. My voice was shaking as I asked the server for a phone. She eyed me with concern, as if not sure whether to help or ask me to leave. She then pointed me to a phone in the corner, behind the counter. I thanked her and staggered over. I dialed 911. When the operator answered, my voice tumbled out in a rush. I recounted the robbery in stilted fragments. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up outside, and 2 officers stepped in. They listened to my story. After I was done, they gave me a ride home. The next day, my car was discovered in a ditch off the highway, about 50 miles outside of our city. The man was long gone by then, and my wallet was never recovered. The police were never able to catch the guy who robbed me that night. My only hope is that he gets caught someday, and they put him away for a very long time. I'm an Uber driver, and I work mostly nights in my town, which has a population of around 200,000 people. The night was cool and misty as I navigated the city streets. It was about 11 p.m., and I was thinking about calling it quits for the night. That day was slow, and I hadn't made enough money yet, so I was planning on taking a few more rides. The notification on my phone chimed for a ride request. A name appeared on the screen: Alex. I glanced at the pin on the map. It was about 5 miles away from where I was at the moment. Pretty convenient, so I accepted. I adjusted the rearview mirror, checked my appearance, and made sure the interior of the car was tidy. My last ride was a group of drunk girls, so I wanted to make sure they didn't leave anything. My GPS led me through the streets. Houses were sparsely placed among the winding roads. I arrived at the spot, a corner beneath a flickering streetlight. A figure emerged from the shadows. His face was hidden behind the hood of a dark jacket. I unlocked the door, and he slipped into my back seat without a word. "Hey, Alex," I greeted, trying to inject some warmth into my voice. No response. He remained silent. I thought it was kind of rude, but to be honest, I didn't feel like talking either, so I didn't care. I glanced at my phone and saw the destination. It was a set of coordinates, rather than an actual address. This wasn't entirely uncommon. Sometimes passengers were dropped off in spots without a specific street name. The spot was out of town, in a fairly remote area. I followed the directions, glancing in my rearview mirror every few seconds. Alex was just sitting back there, looking out the window. Something about him made me feel strange. I've seen all kinds of people, and I think I've developed a decent sense for them. Something was off about this guy. As minutes stretched on into what felt like hours, I grew increasingly uneasy. The silence from the back seat was uncomfortable. The only sound was the occasional rustle of fabric. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. There was hardly a movement from him. Finally, we arrived at a desolate spot on the outskirts of town. It was a place I'd never been before. There was no reason to go out there. I could see a house up ahead in the distance, and if I looked behind me, there was the faint glow of the city. Other than that, the area was just surrounded by trees. I pulled to a stop, glancing around nervously. "This is it," I said. Still no response from the back seat. The silence hung in the air, pressing down on me like a rather heavy weight. I was about to ask if we'd arrived in the right place when I heard it. The low growl of an engine in the distance, growing steadily louder. Headlights pierced through the darkness, revealing a truck hurtling towards us. Thinking it was some random stranger, I pulled the car over to the shoulder to let him pass, but that didn't happen. Instead, the truck stopped right next to me. At that moment, I heard my back door open. My passenger got out. A man then got out of the truck and approached the driver's side of my car. Thankfully, I had the window up. It was a false sense of security, but it was better than nothing. Out of nowhere, the man pulled something out of his pocket, and before I knew it, my window was smashed. Tiny pieces of glass rained all over me as I tried to comprehend what was happening. It took me a few seconds, but I managed to shift my car into gear, and I ripped out of there. After a few miles, I pulled out my phone and called the police. When they got to the spot, the truck and my passenger were both gone. All that was left were some pieces of glass from my broken window. The police drove with me until we reached the relative safety of the city. It wasn't until then that I allowed myself to fully process what had just happened. After getting home, I tried to sleep. All things considered, I'm grateful that I got away from those guys. There's no telling what they were after. I didn't have a whole lot to steal, and my car was not worth much either. I guess some people will take whatever they can get. I've heard other drivers tell me about similar scams. Things can get a lot worse than a broken window, so I'm very thankful that it ended the way it did.